Tonight, as we settle into the comfort of our own age, let us travel back through the mists of time to walk the streets of ancient Athens, to climb the sacred hill of the Acropolis, to stand in the Agora where democracy was born, and to witness the birth of philosophy, drama, and the scientific method that still shape our world today. Before there were temples or philosophers, before democracy or drama, there was the land itself, the rocky peninsula of Attica, jutting into the Aegean Sea like a finger pointing toward the islands and the civilizations of the East. The landscape that would give birth to Athens was harsh and unforgiving. The thin soil covering the limestone bedrock made agriculture challenging. The mountains that ringed the plain of Attica created natural barriers, isolating early settlements but also protecting them. And at the heart of this landscape rose a massive outcrop of solid limestone, the rock that would become the Acropolis, the sacred hill that would define Athens for all time. This geography shaped everything that followed. The poor soil meant Athens could never be a purely agricultural power like the rich plains of Thessaly or the river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Instead, the Athenians would turn to the sea, to trade, and ultimately to empire. The Acropolis provided a natural fortress, nearly impregnable, around which the earliest settlement clustered for protection. The rise of Athens began 500 years before the birth of Christ, though human habitation of the site stretched back thousands of years earlier into the mists of prehistory. No other city has shaped the Western world so profoundly as Athens. History's most famous philosophers lived and taught here. Socrates questioning everything, Plato dreaming of ideal forms, Aristotle cataloging the natural world with systematic precision. The fine arts blossomed here as nowhere else. Sculptors like Phidias created works of such beauty that they became the standard against which all subsequent art would be measured. Playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides invented tragedy, exploring the deepest questions of human existence through drama. Aristophanes perfected comedy, using laughter as a weapon to critique society and its follies. The natural sciences took root in Athenian soil. Philosophers turned their penetrating minds to understanding the physical world, laying the foundations for physics, biology, and astronomy. And it was the citizens of Athens who gave the world a new type of government, democracy, rule by the people, a radical notion that challenged every assumption about power and authority that had prevailed since the dawn of civilization. Every great city has its founding myths, and Athens was no exception. The Athenians traced their origins to Cecrops, a mythical king who was half man, half serpent, a fitting symbol for a people caught between earthly pragmatism and divine aspiration. According to legend, the city's name came from a divine contest. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, and Poseidon, god of the sea, both desired to be the patron deity of the city. To settle the dispute, they agreed to each give a gift to the people, who would then choose their patron. Poseidon struck the Acropolis rock with his trident, and a spring of seawater gushed forth, a symbol of naval power and maritime trade. Athena planted an olive tree, which would provide food, oil for lamps, and wood for building. The people chose Athena's gift, recognizing that while the sea was important, the olive tree represented sustainable prosperity and peace. Whether or not one believes these legends, they reveal something profound about how the Athenians understood themselves. They saw their city as favored by the goddess of wisdom, not the god of war or wealth. They valued thoughtful gifts over flashy displays of power, and they believed that the people themselves should make the choice about who would rule them, a democratic impulse present even in their mythology. The archaeological reality behind the myths reveals a more gradual development. The Acropolis was inhabited as early as the Neolithic period, around 5000 BCE. The natural fortress provided security for early farmers who cultivated the surrounding plains and kept animals in the protected valleys. During the Bronze Age, roughly 1600–1100 BCE, Athens was a Mycenaean stronghold. The massive Cyclopean walls built during this period, walls so large that later Greeks believed they must have been built by giants, still form part of the Acropolis fortifications. Athens appears in the linear B tablets found at Pylos and other Mycenaean sites, confirming that even in this distant era, Athens was an important center. When the Bronze Age civilizations collapsed around 1200 BCE in a wave of destruction that swept across the eastern Mediterranean, Athens survived where many other cities fell. The Athenians later claimed they were autochthonous, born from the soil itself, never conquered or displaced. While this was an exaggeration, Athens did experience less disruption than many Greek cities during the Dark Ages that followed the Mycenaean collapse. Through the dark centuries from roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, when writing was lost and monumental architecture ceased, Athens endured. The population shrank, technology regressed, and international trade collapsed. But the sacred olive tree continued to grow on the Acropolis, and people continued to gather at the foot of the rock, maintaining a thread of continuity that would eventually lead to the glory of classical Athens. As Greece emerged from the Dark Ages around 800 BCE, Athens began its transformation from a provincial backwater into a major power. This archaic period, from roughly 800 to 500 BCE, saw the development of many of the institutions and cultural forms that would define classical Athens. The Greek alphabet was adopted from the Phoenicians, adapted to represent Greek sounds. Writing returned, and with it came the possibility of recording laws, preserving poetry and maintaining permanent records, all essential for the development of complex civilization. The population grew as agriculture recovered and trade expanded. Attica's poor soil was ideal for growing olives and grapes, and Athens began exporting olive oil and wine throughout the Mediterranean in distinctive painted pottery vessels. These exports brought wealth that allowed the city to import grain from the Black Sea colonies, supporting a larger urban population. Social stratification increased. An aristocracy of birth controlled most of the land and dominated political and religious offices. Below them were small farmers who worked their own land but struggled to maintain independence as population pressure increased. At the bottom were the Thetes, landless laborers and urban poor who worked for others or engaged in trade, activities the aristocracy considered beneath their dignity. Tensions between classes threatened to tear the city apart. Farmers fell into debt and lost their land to aristocratic creditors. Some were sold into slavery when they couldn't pay. The dispossessed threatened rebellion. Athens stood at a crossroads: descend into tyranny or civil war, or find a new way forward. Solon, the first democratic reformer, 594 BCE. Facing imminent crisis, the Athenians turned to Solon, a respected aristocrat known for his wisdom and poetry. They gave him extraordinary powers to reform the constitution and resolve the social conflicts tearing the city apart. Solon's reforms were revolutionary, though they fell short of full democracy. He abolished debt slavery, freed those who had been enslaved for debt, and even bought back Athenians who had been sold abroad. He canceled existing debts secured by land or personal freedom, the famous shaking off of burdens, seisachtheia. To prevent the recurrence of debt crisis, Solon limited the amount of land any individual could accumulate and forbade using one's person as security for debt. These measures protected small farmers from falling into permanent servitude to the wealthy. Politically, Solon maintained the aristocratic offices, but opened them to all citizens who met property qualifications, not just those of noble birth. He created a council of 400 drawn from the 4 traditional tribes, providing a wider base for political participation. Most radically, he established the assembly, ecclesia, where all male citizens could gather to vote on important matters. He also established the Heliaia, popular law courts where large citizen juries judged cases. This removed legal disputes from the arbitrary control of aristocratic magistrates and placed justice in the hands of ordinary citizens. Solon reformed the Athenian legal code. replacing the archaic laws of Draco, which prescribed death for even minor offenses, hence our word draconian, with more reasonable penalties. He published the laws on wooden tablets displayed in the Agora, making them accessible to all literate citizens. After implementing his reforms, Solon famously left Athens for 10 years, refusing to modify his laws under pressure from any faction. He wrote, "I gave the common people such privilege as was sufficient, neither adding nor taking away. Those who had power and were admired for wealth, I saw to it that they also suffered no inappropriate treatment. It was a delicate balance, satisfying neither the aristocrats who wanted to maintain all their privileges, nor the poor who wanted radical redistribution of land. But Solon had planted seeds that would eventually flower into democracy. He established the principle that laws should be written and public, that all citizens should participate in government, and that political power should be based on wealth and ability rather than birth alone." Solon's reforms didn't end political conflict. Within decades, Athens fell under the control of Pisistratos, who seized power in 546 BCE and ruled as tyrant, not in our modern sense of a cruel oppressor, but in the Greek sense of one who ruled outside the traditional constitutional framework. Pisistratos was a benevolent tyrant who used his power to benefit the common people and beautify the city. He redistributed some aristocratic land to small farmers, provided loans for agricultural improvement, and instituted traveling judges to bring justice to rural areas. Under his rule, Athens prospered economically. Culturally, Pisistratos transformed Athens. He instituted the Great Panathenea, an elaborate festival every 4 years celebrating Athens and her patron goddess. He established the city Dionysia, the festival during which the great tragic and comic dramas would be performed. He commissioned the first written edition of Homer's epics, standardizing texts that had previously existed only in oral tradition. Most importantly, for the physical appearance of Athens, Pisistratos began a building program that would transform the Acropolis and Agora. He started construction of a massive temple to Athena on the Acropolis, though it wouldn't be completed until after his dynasty fell. He adorned the Agora with fountains and public buildings. Under his rule, Athens began to look like the magnificent city it would become. When Pisistratos died in 528 BCE, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus continued his policies. But they lacked their father's political skill and popular touch. Hipparchus was assassinated in 514 BCE by Harmodius and Aristogeiton, two lovers who became celebrated as tyrannicides, even though their motives were personal rather than political. Hippias grew paranoid and tyrannical in the modern sense, imposing harsh controls on the population. In 510 BCE, Hippias was expelled with help from Sparta. The tyranny had ended, but what would replace it? The aristocrats hoped to restore their dominance, but a visionary politician named Cleisthenes had other ideas. In 508-507 BCE, Cleisthenes implemented a series of radical reforms that created Athenian democracy as we know it. Building on Solon's foundation, but going much further, Cleisthenes restructured Athenian society and politics in ways that broke the power of the old aristocratic families and placed power directly in the hands of the people. His masterstroke was reorganizing the citizen body. Previously, Athenians belonged to 4 traditional tribes based on kinship and dominated by aristocratic families. Cleisthenes created 10 new tribes, each composed of dems, neighborhoods or villages, from 3 different regions of Attica: the city, the coast, and the inland. This artificial system broke up traditional power bases and forced citizens to identify primarily as Athenians rather than as members of kinship groups. Each tribe selected 50 men by lot to serve on the new Council of 500 bull, which replaced Solon's Council of 400. This council prepared business for the assembly and handled day-to-day administration. By selecting members by lot rather than election, Cleisthenes ensured that ordinary citizens, not just the eloquent and wealthy, could serve. The assembly, ecclesia, became the supreme authority, open to all male citizens over 18. It met regularly on the Pnyx, a hill west of the Acropolis. Here, any citizen could speak, and important decisions were made by a majority vote. The assembly declared war and peace, passed laws, approved budgets, and elected the 10 generals, strategoi, who commanded the army and navy. To protect democracy from would-be tyrants, Cleisthenes instituted ostracism. Once a year, the assembly could vote to exile any citizen for 10 years without loss of property or citizenship. Citizens scratched names on pottery shards, ostraca, and if 6,000 votes were cast and one person received a plurality, he was exiled. This gave the people a peaceful way to remove dangerous politicians without resorting to assassination or civil war. Cleisthenes' reforms were genuinely revolutionary. For the first time in human history, thousands of ordinary people, not kings, priests, or aristocrats, held political power and made decisions collectively. It was messy, contentious, and sometimes made poor decisions. But it was ruled by the people, democratia, from demos, people, and kratos, power. The young Athenian democracy immediately faced an existential threat. The Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretched from India to Egypt. Under Darius I, the Persians had conquered the Greek cities of Asia Minor, modern Turkey. When these cities revolted in 499 BCE, Athens sent ships to help them. The revolt failed, and Darius did not forget Athenian interference. In 490 BCE, a Persian expedition landed at Marathon, a plain northeast of Athens. The Athenian army, heavily outnumbered, faced the choice of retreating behind Athens' walls or meeting the Persians in open battle. Against all expectations, the Athenians chose to fight. Led by the general Miltiades, they charged the Persian lines. The Greek hoplites, heavily armored infantry fighting in close formation in the phalanx, crashed into the lightly armored Persian infantry. In fierce hand-to-hand fighting, the Athenians won a stunning victory, killing thousands of Persians while losing only 192 of their own. After the battle, the Athenian army raced back to Athens to prevent the Persian fleet from taking the undefended city. The runner Phidippides, who had run to Sparta before the battle to request aid, supposedly ran from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory, then collapsed and died, the origin of our modern marathon race. Marathon proved that the Persians could be defeated. It gave the Athenians enormous confidence and prestige throughout Greece. But the Persians would return, and next time in overwhelming force. The real hero of the Persian wars was Themistocles, a brilliant strategist who understood that Athens' future lay on the sea. In 483 BCE, when rich silver deposits were discovered at Laurion in southern Attica, Themistocles convinced the Athenians to use the windfall. Not for a distribution to citizens, as was customary, but to build a fleet of 200 triremes, state-of-the-art warships. This decision proved crucial. In 480 BCE, Xerxes, Darius' son, invaded Greece with an enormous army and fleet. The Spartans made their legendary stand at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and their allies fought to the death to delay the Persian advance. But delay was all they could achieve. The Persians swept south, capturing and burning Athens. The Athenians had evacuated their city, trusting in the wooden walls that the oracle at Delphi had cryptically promised would save them. Themistocles interpreted wooden walls to mean ships, not the wooden palisades of the Acropolis at Salamis. In the straits between Attica and the island of Salamis, the Greek fleet, mostly Athenian ships, faced the larger Persian fleet. Themistocles lured the Persians into the narrow straits where their numbers were useless. In the confined space, the heavier Greek triremes rammed and sank the Persian ships. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne on the shore, saw his fleet destroyed. The next year, 479 BCE, at Plataea, a combined Greek army defeated the Persian land forces. The Persians retreated from Greece, never to return in force. Athens, which had borne the brunt of the fighting and suffered the most destruction, emerged as the acknowledged leader of the Greeks. The Delian League and Athenian Empire, to prevent future Persian attacks, Athens organized the Delian League in 478 BCE, a defensive alliance of Greek city-states. The League's treasury was kept on the sacred island of Delos. Member states contributed either ships or money, with Athens providing the largest contingent and commanding the fleet. What began as a defensive alliance gradually transformed into an Athenian empire. When some cities tried to leave the League, Athens forced them to remain, arguing that the Persian threat still existed. The treasury was moved from Delos to Athens in 454 BCE, and Athens began using League funds for its own purposes, including the massive building program that would create the Parthenon and other monuments. The League brought enormous wealth to Athens. Tribute flowed in from hundreds of cities across the Aegean. This wealth funded not only buildings, but also payments to citizens for jury service and attendance at the assembly, allowing even the poor to participate fully in democracy. Athens had become an imperial democracy, democratic at home, imperial abroad. For much of the middle third of the 5th century BCE, Athens was dominated by Pericles, an aristocrat who nevertheless championed radical democracy and used his oratorical skills to guide the assembly without ever holding dictatorial power. Pericles expanded democracy, introducing pay for jury service and other offices so that poor citizens could afford to participate. He restricted citizenship, requiring that both parents be Athenian citizens, a measure that created a more exclusive citizen body but also strengthened Athenian identity. Under Pericles, Athens reached its peak of power and cultural achievement. He oversaw the rebuilding of the Acropolis temples destroyed by the Persians, creating the magnificent structures that still crown the sacred rock today. He supported artists, philosophers, and playwrights, making Athens the cultural capital of Greece. The historian Thucydides recorded a famous funeral oration Pericles delivered for Athenians killed in battle. In it, Pericles articulated the ideals of Athenian democracy. Our constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few. This is why it is called a democracy. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. Class considerations are not allowed to interfere with merit. Nor again does poverty bar the way. He continued, the freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. We do not feel called upon to be angry with our neighbor for doing what he likes. While we are thus unconstrained in our private business, a spirit of reverence pervades our public acts. We are prevented from doing wrong by respect for the authorities and for the laws. This was Athens at its finest. Confident, prosperous, democratic, and culturally creative. But this golden age would not last. Daily life in Golden Age Athens, to truly understand classical Athens, we must imagine daily life in the crowded streets around the Agora, in the workshops where artisans created beauty, in the homes where families lived and children learned. The Greek historian Pausanias wrote about an extraordinary woman of that era. Phryne was one of Athens' most famous hetairai, or courtesans. The mistress of important men, scholars, artists, and politicians fell under her spell. Her wealth and beauty were legendary, but pride led her into mortal danger. She was accused of impiety, one of the gravest crimes in Athens. The gods demanded respect, but it was mortals who would judge her. In the 5th century BCE, approximately 300,000 people lived in Athens and its surrounding territory of Attica, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The city was at its peak then, though it would experience a long period of decline afterward. It was only in the 20th century that Athens regained its ancient size. Today, the metropolitan area has over 4 million inhabitants. The ancient city was densely packed within its walls. Houses crowded together along narrow, winding streets. Unlike the wide, planned avenues of later cities, Athenian streets followed ancient paths and property lines, creating a maze-like layout. Only the Panathenaic Way, the broad ceremonial road leading from the city gates to the Acropolis, stood out as a major thoroughfare. Most Athenians lived modestly. The typical house was built around a small central courtyard, with rooms opening onto this interior space rather than the street. This provided privacy and security while allowing light and air into the home. The courtyard often contained a small altar where the family made offerings to household gods. Homes were built of mud brick on stone foundations with tiled roofs. They were small by modern standards. Even wealthy homes rarely exceeded 200-300 square meters of floor space. Interior walls were plastered and sometimes painted, though rarely with the elaborate frescoes found in wealthy Roman homes. Furniture was simple: beds, chairs, small tables, and chests for storage. Women spent most of their time in the house, especially in the women's quarters, gynekonitis, on an upper floor or in the rear of the house. Here they spun, wove, oversaw slaves, and managed the household. Respectable women rarely appeared in public except for religious festivals and funerals. Their world was domestic, centered on family and household management. Men, by contrast, spent little time at home. They rose early, perhaps eating a simple breakfast of bread dipped in wine. They then went to the Agora to conduct business, engage in politics, or simply socialize. The Agora was the center of male public life: marketplace, political arena, and social club all in one. The Agora was the marketplace of ancient Athens, located in the city center at the foot of the Acropolis. Archaeologists from the American School of Classical Studies have been excavating this site for over 70 years, gradually uncovering the densely built-up residential and commercial area. Professor John Camp, who has led the excavations for decades, explains, "The purpose of the excavations is to uncover the center of ancient Athens. That is where the public life took place. Around the big square, which was the Agora proper, were all the public buildings you needed to run the city: Senate building, the archive building, the magistrates' offices, the law courts, the mint. Pretty much everything you needed in an administrative way was somewhere near the square. Our purpose is to expose the historic center of Athens. The Agora was the social and political meeting place of the Athenians. People came to see and to be seen, to transact business, to hear the latest news and gossip, to participate in politics. It was where democracy came alive in the daily interactions of citizens. The square itself was an open space, shaded by plane trees and surrounded by spacious arcades, stoas, where merchants had their stalls and citizens gathered to escape the sun's heat. The Stoa of Attilos, a two-story colonnaded building that has been reconstructed, now houses the American Schools Museum and gives visitors a sense of what these magnificent structures looked like. Around the square stood the essential buildings of democratic government: the Bouleuterion, meeting place of the Council of 500, where the council prepared business for the assembly and handled day-to-day administration; the Tholos, a round building where the 50 members of the presiding tribe, the Prytanes, ate meals at public expense, and where some stayed overnight to handle emergencies, a kind of executive committee always on duty; the Matroon, housing the state archives, where laws and decrees were inscribed on stone and stored for public reference; the Royal Stoa, where the Archon Basileus, the official in charge of religious matters and homicide trials, had his office; the law courts, where citizen juries numbering in the hundreds judged cases; the altar of the 12 gods, from which distances throughout Attica were measured, the symbolic center of the Athenian state. Walking through the excavated Agora today, one can still sense its former vitality. The archaeologists have found a deep well dating to the time of Pericles and the Parthenon. For 3 years, Professor Camp's team has been studying this well, gradually getting an idea of what the site looked like in ancient times. Behind the administrative buildings, narrow streets led into a cramped, densely built residential area where the common citizens lived. Professor Camp notes, While there are certainly very rich houses and elegant villas, most of the houses we have near the Agora are very poor and not very comfortable. They have clay floors. The rooms are centered around a courtyard which would have provided some light and air, but they would have been very dark from our point of view. Very badly furnished, probably not too many windows, because there was no way of closing them off and still letting the light in. So I think that's one of the reasons there's such an outdoor public life. Being home wasn't all that much fun. This explains much about Athenian culture. The modest, uncomfortable homes drove men into public spaces. Democracy flourished because citizens spent their days in face-to-face interaction in the Agora and assembly, not isolated in private dwellings. The artifacts found in the Agora excavations are analyzed and classified in the American Schools laboratory. Sometimes it's the small items that reveal the most about larger issues. Small bowls found near hearths in humble dwellings initially puzzled archaeologists. They were discovered alongside burnt bones of small animals, which analysis revealed to be sacrificial remains. These bowls and bones represent domestic religious rituals, ordinary Athenians asking the gods for health, happiness, and success in business. Religion permeated every aspect of Athenian daily life. There was no separation between sacred and secular. Before making a business deal, one sacrificed. Before beginning a sea voyage, one made offerings. Before the assembly met, animals were sacrificed and omens read. The gods were not distant abstractions, but intimate participants in daily affairs. The artifacts also reveal Athens' extensive trading connections. Professor Camp notes, "It's fairly clear that Athenian trading connections were very extensive. A lot of their grain, maybe most of their grain, came from the Ukraine, from the north side of the Black Sea. They were importing wine from Asia Minor and the island of Rhodes. Athenian coins have been found in Egypt. They've been found practically as far away as Afghanistan and far to the west as well. The coins obviously can pass from hand to hand, but it's clear that goods came in from all over the world. Amphorae, the universal containers for transporting goods in antiquity, have been found by the hundreds at the Agora. These large ceramic vessels with two handles and a pointed base, designed to be stuck in sand or a ship's hold, transported wine, olive oil, grain, and other commodities throughout the Mediterranean world. Many of the amphorae found at Athens came from far away, stamped with the seals of producers from Rhodes, Thasos, and other trading centers. This physical evidence confirms the written sources. Athens was a trading power, and democracy took up a great deal of citizens' time. But no one lost money by taking part in political decisions. The state paid for participation, ensuring that even the poor could afford to be citizens. The visible proof of religion's importance was the Parthenon, crowning the Acropolis. An elaborate frieze that once ran around the top of the building's inner chamber illustrates the Athenians' relationship with their gods. The frieze, originally painted in bright colors that have long since faded, shows the Panathenaic procession, the magnificent annual parade held in honor of Athena. Every year, and with special grandeur every 4 years at the great Panathenaea, the Athenians processed up the steep sacred way to the Acropolis. The procession included the entire citizen body. Charioteers demonstrated their skill at maneuvering their nimble chariots up the steep, winding path. Venerable elders, men who had served Athens faithfully for decades, walked with dignity. Young men in their prime carried heavy amphorae of water for ritual purification. Maidens bore the sacred peplos, a robe woven specially for Athena's statue, to be placed upon the ancient wooden image of the goddess that was Athens' most sacred possession. Priests led sacrificial animals, cattle, sheep, and goats, whose meat would be distributed to citizens after being offered to the goddess. Musicians played double flutes and lyres. The entire city participated in honoring its patron. Such events were always big celebrations for everyone. There were no professional priests in democratic Athens. Citizens themselves performed the rituals. Citizens judged when proper respect had been shown. Citizens shared in the sacrificial meat. The Athenians related to their gods in a relaxed and confident way, quite different from the fear and trembling that characterized some other ancient religions. The gods frequently descended from Mount Olympus, taking on human form to mingle with mortals and enjoy themselves, sometimes heroically, sometimes licentiously. The gods were like humans, only more powerful, more beautiful, more passionate. They felt jealousy, anger, love, and desire. They intervened in human affairs, taking sides in wars, helping favored mortals, punishing those who offended them, but the gods demanded humility and absolute respect for mortals. Hubris, excessive pride, thinking oneself equal to the gods, was the gravest sin. It inevitably brought divine retribution, nemesis, often in ironic or terrible forms. Greek tragedy constantly explored this theme, humans overreaching, defying the gods or fate and suffering the consequences. It's just after sunrise on a crisp Athenian morning. Architect Nikos Toganidis stands at the base of the Acropolis, squinting up at the sacred rock as the first rays of sunlight illuminate the Parthenon's columns. He is expecting a special delivery today. A massive marble block weighing over a ton has arrived from the quarries at Mount Pentelicon, the same source that provided marble for the original Parthenon 2,500 years ago. This block must be hoisted 150 meters up the rocky slope of the Acropolis, the impregnable center of ancient Athens that served as fortress, religious sanctuary, and symbol of the city's power and glory. The Acropolis is crowned by the city's most famous building, the Parthenon, which the Athenians built to celebrate their victory in 479 BCE over the Persians, who had sacked and burned their city. The Persians destroyed the earlier temples on the Acropolis, and when the Athenians returned, they vowed to rebuild their sacred precinct more magnificently than ever. 1,500 years later, this monument is being taken apart and reassembled to rectify the mistakes of 19th century restorations and to repair damage from centuries of use, misuse, and weathering. The restoration team uses modern technology, computer modeling, laser measurements, cranes, but they work with deep respect for ancient methods. Every stone is carefully documented, numbered, and photographed before removal. When damage is found, decisions must be made. Can this ancient stone be repaired, or must a new one be carved to replace it? Toganidis explains with evident passion. The Parthenon was the most outstanding building of its time. A 2-story high gallery of columns supported the roof of this temple erected by the citizens in honor of Athena, the goddess of victory. Inside the temple stood her statue, 12 meters high, decorated with gold and ivory, one of the wonders of the ancient world. The workshops where restoration work is carried out are located exactly where the original workers' huts once stood, on terraces carved into the Acropolis slope. After the restoration is complete, the Parthenon will still have its familiar look of a ruin. There is no attempt to completely rebuild it. The approach is conservative. Repair or complete the damaged parts, use newly sculpted marble blocks only when absolutely necessary to maintain structural integrity. It's amazing, Toganidis continues. Every point, as we are studying and we are working all these years close to the monument, we are discovering again the same techniques. We are obliged to do the same things because we understand finally that it's the best way to do it. Piece by piece, the Parthenon is being dismantled, studied, and carefully reassembled. This is the only way the architectural sins of previous restorations can be corrected. In the 19th century, well-meaning but misguided restorers used iron clamps to hold stones together. These iron clamps rusted and expanded, cracking the ancient marble. Today's architects use titanium, which won't corrode, and they aim to make their work as historically accurate as possible. Their respect for the tremendous technical and logistical achievements of the ancient builders increases with every day of work. As one restoration architect marvels, knowing all these facilities that we have in our hands, papers, computers, whatever, and knowing how difficult it is to organize and to control all these things, I cannot imagine that period without paper. Imagine where they were drawing, how they could communicate and coordinate thousands of workers, and still do this fine work. It's incredible. The Parthenon was built in just 15 years, beginning in 447 BCE, during the height of Athens' power under Pericles. This was a period when Greek philosophers were laying the foundations of modern science. Pythagoras had developed the basic principles of mathematics, discovering the mathematical ratios that create musical harmony. Democritus would soon declare the atom to be the foundation of all things. The natural world, the Greeks believed, could be understood through reason and mathematics. The Parthenon is proof of the superb building techniques of the ancient Greeks and their sophisticated understanding of geometry and optics. Nothing about this building is as simple as it first appears. The sides of the columns, for instance, are tapered. They narrow as they rise. If extended upward, the sides would eventually meet at a point several kilometers in the sky. This means that none of the columns is truly vertical, yet they are all executed precisely to the millimeter. This tapering, called entasis, prevents the optical illusion that would make straight columns appear to bow inward. The slight swelling also makes the columns appear stronger and more organic, as if they were tree trunks rather than carved stone. Moreover, the Parthenon contains no straight lines. The stylobate, the platform on which the columns stand, curves upward slightly in the middle, about 6 centimeters over the building's 70-meter length. If it were perfectly flat, it would appear to sag in the middle when viewed from a distance. By curving it upward, the architects created the optical illusion of perfect straightness. The columns are not evenly spaced. The corner columns are slightly closer to their neighbors and slightly thicker than the others. This compensates for the bright Mediterranean light that would make corner columns appear thinner if they were the same size as the rest. Every refinement, every subtle curve and adjustment was calculated to create perfect visual harmony. Every stone has secrets, explains restoration architect Manolis Korres, from the architectural point of view. The proportions are special, and also there are other things about the function, the real function of the building, how water penetrates and drains, for instance. The curvature of the floor is probably one of the reasons. The material that they used to connect the blocks between them, the metal elements, the technique is similar to fine metalwork, like the intricate bronze work of archaic swords. The ancient builders achieved these perfect proportions using only geometric calculations. Compass, ruler, and plumb line were their only tools. There were no blueprints in the modern sense, no detailed working drawings. The proportions were determined by mathematical ratios. The famous golden ratio appears repeatedly in the Parthenon's design. Knowledge was transmitted through training and tradition, from master craftsmen to apprentices, encoded in practical techniques rather than written formulas. While the Parthenon commanded the highest point of the Acropolis, the entrance to the sacred precinct was equally magnificent. The Propylaea, constructed between 437 and 432 BCE, was the monumental gateway through which all visitors passed when ascending to the temples. The architect Mnesicles designed the Propylaea to be both functionally effective and aesthetically overwhelming. As one climbed the sacred way and approached the gateway, the building seemed to grow larger and more imposing with each step. The gateway's central passage was wide enough for the Panathenaic procession with its animals and chariots to pass through, while side passages accommodated pedestrian traffic. For 2,500 years, the Propylaea has been the gateway to the Acropolis and the Parthenon. Like the Parthenon itself, it is now being renovated in a historically accurate way. Every stone is being removed, cleaned of old mortar and later additions, and carefully restored. The architect Tassos Tanoulis, who has overseen the Propylaea restoration for over 30 years, sees the building as more than just an architectural monument. For him, it symbolizes a fundamental aspect of Athenian democracy. The Propylaea is par excellence a secular building. This is a new idea in ancient Greek architecture, a building which was meant for the people. It had benches all along the walls of the porches in the central building, and also the rooms of the wings. The Pinacotheca, which was a kind of art gallery where paintings were displayed, was open for people to enter and enjoy. They were meant for sacrificial meals, so they were for the people to enter and to enjoy their architecture and luxury. There was a temple's luxury in a secular building, the first time in history. This is a profound point. A splendid building such as the Propylaea was not erected for gods or kings, but by citizens, for citizens of a free city. It is a symbol of the self-confidence and pride of democratic Athens, a statement that the people themselves, collectively, deserved beauty and magnificence in their public spaces. The Propylaea also contained the Pinacotheca, one of the world's first public art galleries. Here, paintings on wooden panels, none of which survive, were displayed for citizens to view. Art was not locked away in private collections or temples, but was accessible to the public, another democratic innovation. Among the artists working in Athens during its golden age, none was more celebrated than Phidias, the sculptor who supervised the artistic program of the Acropolis and who created the colossal statue of Athena that stood inside the Parthenon. This statue, called the Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin, stood 12 meters high. The figure was constructed around a wooden core with exposed skin areas made of ivory plates and clothing and armor of gold sheets. Over a ton of gold was used. The goddess wore a crested helmet, held a statue of Victory, Nike, in her outstretched hand, and rested her other hand on a shield beside which coiled a sacred serpent. The interior of the shield was decorated with scenes of the battle between gods and giants. The exterior showed Athenians fighting Amazons. The statue was deliberately designed to be overwhelming, radiating divine power and majesty. Ancient viewers reported being awestruck, feeling they were in the presence of the goddess herself. Sadly, the statue was later removed to Constantinople, where it was destroyed in late antiquity. We know it only from ancient descriptions and much smaller copies. The Parthenon's sculptural program, also overseen by Phidias, was extensive. The two pediments, triangular spaces at the east and west ends, contained elaborate sculptural groups showing the birth of Athena from Zeus's head and the contest between Athena and Poseidon for patronage of the city. 92. Metopes, square panels above the columns, showed various mythological battles. Greeks fighting Amazons, Lapiths fighting centaurs, gods fighting giants, Greeks destroying Troy. These battles symbolized the victory of civilization over barbarism, order over chaos, Greeks over Persians. Most remarkable was the Ionic frieze that ran around the top of the inner chamber walls. A continuous relief, 160 meters long, showing the Panathenaic procession. Here we see the Athenian people honoring their goddess. Horsemen, chariots, elders, musicians, basket bearers, animals being led to sacrifice, and finally the gods themselves, seated and watching the human procession with benevolent interest. Much of this sculpture was removed in the early 19th century by Lord Elgin and is now in the British Museum, the so-called Elgin. Marbles, though Greece prefers to call them the Parthenon, sculptures, and has long sought their return. What remains in Athens, along with casts of the removed pieces, still conveys the magnificence of the original program. Today, the art of ancient Athens continues to provide people with livelihoods. Reproductions of ancient Greek art objects are sold all over the world. In workshops throughout Athens, artisans practice crafts that have been passed down through generations, maintaining a living connection to the ancient world. In one such workshop, the art of bronze casting continues as it has for over 4,000 years. Today, the craftsmen are casting a tripod, a large bowl supported on 3 legs, a form that was common in ancient times as a prize for athletic or artistic competitions. A new mold must be made for every casting, and each of the many individual parts requires a separate mold. Generations of fathers have passed down to their sons the composition of a special kind of earth that makes it possible to produce these detailed casting molds. The mold maker carefully shapes the special clay mixture, capturing every detail of the relief decoration. The mold for the underside of the bowl is particularly delicate, with its intricate patterns. With an ordinary spoon, he digs channels into which the liquid bronze will later be poured, the gates and risers that will allow the molten metal to flow into every part of the mold. Before the molds are assembled, every detail must be perfect. The bronze has been heated in a furnace for over 2 hours, reaching temperatures above 1,000 degrees Celsius. When the crucible is lifted from the furnace, the molten bronze glows orange-yellow, almost white at its hottest. With careful coordination, the foundry workers pour the liquid metal into the molds. It's a dangerous process. A splash of molten bronze can cause terrible burns, and the molds sometimes crack under the thermal stress, spilling their contents. But these craftsmen have years of experience, their movements practiced and confident. After pouring, the molds must cool slowly. Rapid cooling would cause the bronze to crack or the mold to shatter. The waiting is almost unbearable. Has the cast succeeded? Have they captured all the fine details? Finally, the workers carefully break open the steaming molds. The heat radiating from the freshly cast bronze is intense. Piece by piece, they lift the separate parts from the molds. Success! The cast has captured every detail. But there is still much work to do. Filing, polishing, assembling the parts, adding the final touches that will transform rough castings into a finished work of art. Tripods played a special role in ancient Athens. They were awarded as prizes to the Chorgos, the wealthy citizen who sponsored a theatrical production, whose play won first prize at the dramatic festivals. This was a form of liturgy, a public service that wealthy Athenians were expected to perform. The Chorgos would select, pay, and train the chorus for a tragedy or comedy. He provided their costumes, covered the expenses of production, and essentially acted as the show's producer. If his play won, he received a tripod as his prize. Rather than keeping these tripods at home, the proud chorigoi erected them on tall stone pedestals along the street leading to the Theater of Dionysus. This street, still called Tripod Street, modern Tripodon Street, was lined with these monuments, each with an inscription identifying the sponsor, the playwright, and the year of victory. It was a gallery of cultural achievement, proclaiming Athens' devotion to dramatic art. The well-to-do citizens were the chief patrons of artists, such as Praxiteles, who flourished in the mid-4th century BCE, after the Golden Age had passed, but while Athens remained culturally vibrant. It was considered good form to support the arts, what we might call noblesse oblige. Greek culture flourished thanks to this spirit of patronage, the sense that wealthy individuals had a responsibility to use their resources for the public good. This patronage system had important social and political functions. It redistributed wealth from the rich to the broader community. It gave wealthy citizens a way to gain honor and prestige through public service rather than through political power that might threaten democracy. And it ensured that cultural productions, drama, music, athletic contests were accessible to all citizens, not just the elite. To truly understand ancient Athens, we must imagine daily life in the streets and squares where ordinary people spent their time. The Agora was not only the political heart of democracy, but also the economic center where goods from across the Mediterranean world were bought and sold. The market where today's Athenians shop for fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, and fish in the old city occupies much the same space as the ancient market. The sounds and smells would not be entirely unfamiliar to an ancient Athenian. The calls of vendors, the haggling over prices, the rich aromas of spices and fresh bread, the less pleasant smells of fish stands and butchers' stalls. But the ancient Athenians ate more modestly than modern Greeks. Very few could afford meat regularly. Poorer people ate it only when an animal was sacrificed for a special festival. And even then, the portions distributed to each citizen were small. The wealthy might eat meat more often, but even they consumed it in much smaller quantities than modern people do. Small animals were kept in many houses, chickens for eggs, a goat for milk, perhaps a pig being fattened for an eventual feast. But Athens, situated on rocky Attica with its thin soil, was not ideal for raising large herds. Most meat had to come from elsewhere or from the public sacrifices. Athens was close to the sea, however, so at least there was plenty of fish, which, with bread and thick lentil soup, formed the staple diet for most Athenians. Fish was eaten fresh when possible, but also salted or dried to preserve it. The Athenians particularly prized tuna, which arrived in great seasonal runs, and small fish like anchovies, which could be salted and stored. Bread was made from wheat or barley, depending on what one could afford. Wheat bread was lighter and more expensive. Barley bread was coarser and filled the belly of the poor. Both were usually made at home, though there were professional bakers whose large ovens could produce bread more efficiently than household baking. Fruit and vegetables were very different from today's varieties. The melons were tiny, apples were small and often sour, and it would be 2 millennia before potatoes and tomatoes reached Europe from the New World. But in addition to figs and olives, both abundant in Attica, Athenians enjoyed grapes, pomegranates, pears, and various vegetables, onions, garlic, leeks, cabbage, lettuce, and radishes. Interestingly, Athenians were also fond of grasshoppers and cicadas, which Aristotle praised as great delicacies, especially when roasted. This reminds us that ancient tastes were not always identical to modern ones. No account of Athenian daily life would be complete without discussing wine. The Greeks drank wine at virtually every meal, but always diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, something only uncivilized foreigners would do. Wine was mixed in a large vessel called a crater, typically with a ratio of 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part wine, though ratios varied depending on the occasion and desired effect. The mixture was then ladled into cups for drinking. Wine was not merely a beverage, but a social lubricant, a facilitator of conversation and philosophical discourse. The symposium, literally drinking together, was a central institution of elite male social life in Athens. A symposium was a carefully structured social event that followed a formal dinner. The guests reclined on couches arranged around the walls of the andron, the men's dining room. A symposiarch was elected to determine the wine-to-water ratio and set the evening's tone. Would this be a serious intellectual discussion or a rowdy drinking party? The symposia, hosted by famous courtesans like Phryne, were particularly renowned. These events brought together philosophers, artists, and politicians in an atmosphere of refined pleasure. Guests engaged in intellectual conversation, recited poetry, played drinking games, solved riddles, and were entertained by musicians and dancers. The kylix, a wide, shallow drinking cup, often bore paintings on its interior that were revealed as the drinker emptied the cup. These paintings were frequently erotic or humorous, surprising the drinker and amusing the company. The symposium was an exclusively male affair. Respectable women did not attend. But hetairai, sophisticated courtesans who were educated in music, poetry, and conversation, were welcome. Unlike respectable wives who lived in seclusion in the women's quarters, hetairai moved in male society, attending symposia and providing both intellectual and physical companionship. The lives of Athenian women were sharply circumscribed by gender expectations that modern readers often find shocking. Athens, despite inventing democracy for men, offered women almost no political rights and very limited social freedom. Respectable. Women of citizen families spent most of their lives in the women's quarters, gynaikonitis, of their homes. They managed households, supervised slaves, spun wool, wove cloth, and raised children. They had limited education compared to men, enough to manage a household, but not the extensive training in rhetoric, philosophy, and literature that elite men received. Women's primary identity came through their relationships to men, daughter, wife, mother. Girls were married young, often at 14 or 15, to men typically twice their age. The marriage was arranged by the bride's father and was essentially a transfer of the woman from her father's household to her husband's. Love might develop, but it wasn't a precondition for marriage. Women did not attend the assembly, could not vote, could not own property in their own right, except through certain legal fictions, and could not represent themselves in court. In legal matters, they were perpetual minors who needed a male guardian, kyrios, father, husband, or son. Yet within their sphere, women had real authority. They managed complex households with numerous slaves, controlled significant economics, resources, and made daily decisions that affected family welfare. Their spinning and weaving produced textiles that were essential to the household economy and that represented significant value. Women participated actively in religious festivals, which were numerous and important. The Thesmophoria, for instance, was a fertility festival exclusively for citizen women. The Panathenaea included women in various roles. Women served as priestesses in many cults. In the religious sphere, women had a visibility and importance that was denied them in political life. Wealthy women had more freedom than poor women, paradoxically. They had slaves to do the physical work, giving them leisure for social visits and religious participation. Poor women often had to work outside the home, whether helping in family shops or businesses, or doing hired work like wet nursing, which compromised the ideal of female seclusion, but was economically necessary. The Hetairai occupied a unique position. These courtesans were not respectable in the conventional sense. They could never marry citizens or have legitimate children, but they enjoyed freedoms, not us, denied to respectable women education, participation in male social life, control over their own earnings and choice of companions. The most successful, like Phryne or Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, became wealthy, influential, and famous. Athenian childhood varied dramatically by class and gender. Infant mortality was high. Perhaps 1/3 of children died before age 5. Parents who could afford it hired wet nurses to breastfeed infants, believing this was healthier than having the mother do it. Babies were tightly swaddled, wrapped in strips of cloth to keep their limbs straight. Children played with toys that would be recognizable today: dolls, toy animals, hoops, tops, balls, and miniature furniture. Archaeological excavations have found touching evidence of childhood: small pottery vessels shaped like animals, rattles, even a child's potty chair. Boys and girls lived together in the women's quarters until about age 7, learning from their mothers and nurses. Then the paths diverged sharply. Girls remained in the women's quarters, learning from their mothers the skills they would need as wives: spinning, weaving, household management, basic literacy, if the family was wealthy enough to provide a tutor. Marriage would come at puberty, ending what little childhood they had. Boys, at least those from families that could afford it, began formal education around age 7. They attended schools run by private teachers. There was no public education system. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught by the grammatistes. Physical education was provided by the Paido tribes at the Palestra, wrestling school. Music, especially playing the lyre, was taught by the Kitharistes. The curriculum emphasized memorization of poetry, especially Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which were considered the foundation of Greek culture and values. Boys would recite long passages, learning not just the words, but the rhythms, the values, and the cultural references that every educated Greek was expected to know. Physical education was taken extremely seriously. Boys exercised nude in the palestra, wrestling, running, throwing the discus and javelin. Physical fitness was considered essential for military service and was also valued aesthetically. The Greeks believed that physical beauty reflected inner virtue and that a sound mind required a sound body. At age 18, young men entered a 2-year period of military training, ephibeia, learning to use weapons and serving on frontier garrisons. After completing the service, they became full citizens with the right to participate in the assembly. For wealthy families, education might continue with sophists, traveling teachers who offered advanced instruction in rhetoric, philosophy, and other subjects for substantial fees. The sophists were controversial. Traditionalists like Aristophanes mocked them for teaching young men to make weak arguments appear strong. But they provided the advanced education that ambitious young men needed to succeed in democratic politics. Athenian democracy rested on a foundation of slavery. Slaves performed much of the manual labor that supported the city's economy and freed citizens to participate in politics. Estimates of the slave population vary, but it may have been as large as the free population, perhaps 100,000 slaves in 5th century Athens. Slaves came from various sources: prisoners of war, children of slaves, people purchased from slave traders who obtained their human merchandise from raids or kidnapping. Professor Camp notes, slavery was certainly a fact of daily life, and it's more a question of manpower than anything. But when we look at the records for the buildings on the Acropolis, we find that free Athenians, Greeks from other city-states, and slaves all worked on the building together, all doing exactly the same jobs and all being paid the same daily wage. The lot of slaves varied tremendously. At the bottom of the scale were those who worked in the silver mines at Laurion in southern Attica. These unfortunate souls labored in terrible conditions, in narrow tunnels, often chained, breathing dust-filled air with little hope of freedom or even long survival. Mining was essentially a death sentence. Agricultural slaves worked on farms, often supervised by owners who worked alongside them. Their lives were hard, but not necessarily brutal. And rural slavery seems to have been less harsh than urban slavery. Household slaves performed domestic duties: cooking, cleaning, childcare, shopping, accompanying family members on errands. These slaves, especially those who had been in a family for years, might develop relationships of genuine affection with their owners, though they remained property with no legal rights. Some slaves held skilled positions: accountants, tutors, craftsmen, and lived relatively comfortable lives. Remarkably, some slaves even ran major banks in Athens, handling enormous sums of money despite being property themselves. Manumission, freeing of slaves, did occur, but was not common. Freed slaves became medics, resident aliens, rather than citizens, with legal status superior to slaves, but inferior to citizens. The Athenians did not see slavery as morally problematic. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, argued that some people were natural slaves, suited by nature to be ruled rather than to rule themselves. This rationalization allowed even philosophers to accept an institution that seems abhorrent to modern sensibilities. It's worth reflecting on this contradiction. Athens invented democracy, created magnificent art, and produced philosophical and scientific insights that still shape our world. Yet all of this rested on slave labor. The leisure that allowed citizens to spend days in the assembly or agora was purchased with the unfreedom of others. This uncomfortable truth reminds us that progress is uneven, and that even societies we admire had serious moral blind spots. Outside the city gates, in the hills of Mount Pentelicon, northeast of Athens, were the quarries that provided marble for Athens' magnificent buildings. The marble of Pentelicon is distinctive, pure white when freshly cut, but weathering over centuries to a warm golden honey color that gives Athenian buildings their characteristic appearance. In scorching heat that could reach 40 degrees Celsius in summer, thousands of slaves cut the marble for Athens' temples and monuments. It is estimated that there were 3 slaves to every free citizen of Athens, and many of those slaves labored in the quarries under conditions that were harsh beyond modern imagination. The marble used to reconstruct the Parthenon today is cut by a handful of workers using heavy equipment. The latest technology makes the work safer and faster. Long steel cables set with diamond chips act like giant saws, cutting through solid rock to produce blocks weighing several tons. But the ancient methods of quarrying marble have not been entirely lost. Some specialists still practice the traditional techniques for small-scale work or demonstrations. Stone can still be split the same way as it was 2,500 years ago, with heavy hammers, iron chisels, and a deep knowledge of the structure of marble and how it cleaves along natural planes. The quarrymen would first identify a suitable section of the quarry face. Using iron tools, they would cut deep grooves around the block they intended to extract. Then they would drill a line of holes along the bottom. Into these holes, they would drive wooden wedges and soak them with water. As the wood absorbed water and expanded, it would slowly split the rock, allowing the block to be separated from the mountainside. The gigantic blocks then had to be transported many kilometers to the Acropolis. Carts, pulled by multiple teams of oxen, hauled the huge loads along specially prepared roads. It was slow, exhausting work. A single block might take days to transport from quarry to construction site, while in the city, splendid monuments were being erected to the glory of democracy and Athena. In the quarries, those at the bottom of society were slaving under the most inhumane conditions, their labor making possible the freedom and leisure of citizens. The marble blocks, once delivered to the Acropolis, had to be transformed from rough-cut stone into precisely fitted architectural elements. This required skilled stonemasons, whose craft combined artistic sensibility with mathematical precision. Today's stonemasons working on the Parthenon restoration practice many of the same techniques as their ancient predecessors. They use metal tools, chisels, points, claws, and flat chisels to shape the marble progressively from rough to refined. The work is painstaking and demands immense skill. A single mistake, a chisel blow struck at the wrong angle, excessive force that shatters the stone, can ruin a block that represents months of work and enormous expense. The masons work with constant awareness of the stone's properties, reading the grain, feeling for weaknesses, adjusting their technique to the individual characteristics of each block. The tools used by these modern masons would be familiar to ancient stonemasons. The fundamental technology hasn't changed, hardened steel cutting softer marble through patient, skilled labor. But ancient masons had one disadvantage: their bronze, and iron tools dulled quickly and had to be constantly resharpened. The blacksmith therefore played a crucial role in any large building project. Like Hephaestus, the god of fire and the forge, the blacksmith mastered the interplay of fire, water, and metal to produce hard, sharp tools. Iron ore would be heated in charcoal fires until it became red-hot and malleable. The smith would hammer it into the desired shape, repeatedly heating and hammering until the tool took form. Then came the critical step, hardening. The hot iron would be plunged into water, the sudden cooling transforming the metal structure, making it harder and better able to hold an edge. The finest tools were reserved for the best stonemasons in Greece, craftsmen whose work can still be admired in the Parthenon's remaining sculptures and architectural details. In the residential quarter around the Agora, buildings were constructed with much less care than the temples on the Acropolis. Houses were small and cramped, built of mud brick on rubble foundations, with tiled roofs. Even though their inhabitants were not the richest Athenians, archaeologists are uncovering shards of elaborately painted bowls and vessels, even in these modest dwellings. These pottery vessels provide an impressive image of Greek daily life. The painted scenes show symposia and festivals, athletic contests, and mythological tales. They reveal the aesthetic sensibility that permeated Athenian culture. Even ordinary households aspired to own beautiful objects. Professor Camp observes, "The art mostly reflects the aristocratic style of living, and there were plenty of aristocrats and rich people even in democratic Athens. There are some paintings that show sort of normal activities in shops, fishmongers, cutting up fish, butchers, people working in workshops. But generally the art is sponsored by the aristocracy, and they're going to be interested in feasting and hunting and partying and the things that aristocrats like to do. The disparity between the magnificent public buildings and the modest private homes is striking and significant. It reflects Athenian values. The community deserved magnificence, but private individuals should live modestly. Displaying excessive wealth in one's home might be seen as undemocratic, as setting oneself above one's fellow citizens. This contrasts sharply with later Roman values, where wealthy individuals built lavish private villas to display their status. The Athenians invested their collective wealth in public spaces, where all citizens could enjoy beauty and grandeur. Athenian democracy had deprived the aristocracy of political power. Every citizen had equal rights. But not all citizens were equal in wealth or status. Many old aristocratic families looked back to a long tradition of privilege and still had considerable wealth and influence even in the democracy. They were the ones who could afford the costly amphoras and craters produced by Athens' finest potters and painters. The best vase painters were famous throughout Greece, their work fetching high prices. Pottery vessels signed by master painters, like Ezechias, Euphronios, or the Achilles painter, were prized possessions, status symbols that demonstrated the owner's wealth and cultivated taste. The golden age of Athens could not last. The very success that made Athens great, its wealth, its empire, its confidence, bred resentment among other Greek city-states, particularly Sparta, the other major Greek power. Sparta was Athens' opposite in almost every way. Where Athens was democratic, cultured, maritime, and commercial, Sparta was oligarchic, militaristic, landlocked, and agricultural. Spartan society was organized entirely for war. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 to begin military training. Spartan men lived in military barracks, ate simple communal meals, and devoted their lives to military excellence. A small class of Spartan warriors dominated a large population of helots, serfs, who worked the land. The two cities represented different visions of Greek civilization, and their rivalry was perhaps inevitable. The Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 to 404 BCE, with a brief period of peace in the middle, was a civilizational conflict that ultimately weakened all of Greece. The war began over conflicts between Athenian and Spartan allies. Athens' growing power threatened Sparta and its allies in the Peloponnesian League. Pericles, leading Athens at the war's outbreak, had a strategy. Avoid land battles where Sparta's superior infantry would prevail. Instead, rely on Athens' walls and navy, using sea power to raid enemy coasts while safely importing grain from the Black Sea. But the strategy faced an unexpected challenge. In the second year of the war, a plague struck Athens. The city's population, crowded inside the walls for protection, provided ideal conditions for disease to spread. Thousands died, including Pericles himself in 429 BCE. The plague weakened Athens militarily but also psychologically, shaking confidence in the gods and in democracy itself. The war dragged on for decades, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. Athens won significant victories, particularly in naval battles. But in 415 BCE, Athens made a catastrophic mistake. The Sicilian expedition, Alcibiades, a brilliant but unreliable politician, convinced the assembly to send a massive force to conquer Syracuse in Sicily, the largest Greek city in the west. The expedition was a disaster. Poor leadership, Spartan intervention, and bad luck combined to destroy the entire Athenian force. Thousands of soldiers and sailors dead or enslaved, scores of ships lost. Athens never fully recovered from this blow. Sparta, meanwhile, received aid from Persia, the old enemy now allied with Sparta against Athens. Persian gold allowed Sparta to build a fleet that could challenge Athenian naval supremacy. In 405 BCE, the Spartan admiral Lysander destroyed the Athenian fleet at Agora. Athens, unable to import food and besieged by land and sea, surrendered in 404 BCE. The Spartans tore down the long walls connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus, razed the fortifications, and imposed an oligarchic government of 30 tyrants supported by a Spartan garrison. It was a humiliating end to Athenian greatness. The 30 tyrants' rule was brief and bloody. Within a year, democratic exiles returned, overthrew the oligarchs, and restored democracy. But Athens was weakened, its empire lost, its confidence shaken. The 4th century BCE was a time of constant warfare among Greek city-states. Sparta's attempt to dominate Greece provoked resistance. Thebes, traditionally a secondary power, rose under brilliant generals like Epaminondas to defeat Sparta at Leuctra in 371 BCE. Breaking Spartan military prestige, Athens partially recovered, rebuilding its navy and forming the Second Athenian League. But the city never regained its former dominance. The constant wars exhausted the Greek city-states, draining resources and killing the young men who should have been building families and businesses. Democracy continued to function, but participation declined as citizens grew weary of politics. Ambitious individuals increasingly dominated the assembly through their oratorical skills and their manipulation of popular fears and desires. The quality of political discourse coarsened, with personal attacks replacing substantive debate. Warfare itself changed. The phalanx of citizen soldiers gave way to professional armies of mercenaries who fought for pay rather than patriotism. Military technology evolved with siege engines, improved fortifications, and more sophisticated tactics. The idealized vision of warfare as honorable combat between citizen soldiers was replaced by a grimmer reality of professional violence. Philosophy and rhetoric flourished in this troubled age. Plato, shocked by Socrates' execution in 399 BCE, founded the academy to pursue truth through philosophical inquiry. His student Aristotle systematized knowledge across all fields, from logic and ethics to biology and politics. The sophists taught rhetoric and philosophy to wealthy students preparing for careers in law and politics. The theater continued to entertain and educate citizens. Though tragedy declined, while comedy evolved into lighter entertainment, focusing on stock characters in domestic situations rather than political satire and mythological themes. While the Greek city-states exhausted themselves in mutual warfare, a new power was rising in the north, Macedon. This kingdom, considered semi-barbarous by southern Greeks, was unified and strengthened by King Philip II, who created the most formidable military force in Greece. Philip introduced the Macedonian phalanx, armed with a sarissa, a pike over 5 meters long that gave infantry unprecedented reach. He combined this infantry with heavy cavalry, light infantry, and siege engines in a combined arms approach that proved devastatingly effective. In Athens, the orator Demosthenes recognized the Macedonian threat. In a series of speeches called the Philippics, a term still used for bitter denunciatory speeches, he urged Athens to resist Philip's expansion. "It is not speeches that you need," he thundered, "but action and determination." But Athens could not unite the Greek city-states against Macedon. Old rivalries and mutual suspicions prevented effective cooperation. In 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's army crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. Philip was generous in victory, allowing Athens to retain some autonomy, but the age of the independent city-state was ending. Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE. And his 20-year-old son Alexander became king. This young man, tutored by Aristotle, would transform the world. In just 13 years, Alexander the Great conquered the entire Persian Empire, spreading Greek culture from Egypt to India and creating what historians call the Hellenistic Age. Athens itself played little role in Alexander's conquests. The city had become a cultural and intellectual center rather than a political or military power. When Alexander died in 323 BCE and his empire fragmented among his generals, Athens fell under the control of the Antigonid dynasty ruling Macedon Athens in the Hellenistic Age. Despite loss of political independence, Athens remained culturally important throughout the Hellenistic period, 323-31 BCE. The philosophical schools, Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, and newer schools like the Stoics and Epicureans continued to attract students from across the Mediterranean. The city lived on its cultural capital, its glorious past providing income from tourism and education. Wealthy individuals from across the Greek world sent their sons to study philosophy in Athens. Visitors came to see the Parthenon and other monuments, to walk where Pericles had walked and where Socrates had taught. But the real centers of power and wealth were now elsewhere. Alexandria in Egypt, with its great library and museum, Antioch in Syria, Pergamon in Asia Minor. These new Hellenistic cities, founded or greatly expanded after Alexander, became the political and economic capitals of the Greek-speaking world. Athens experienced periodic revivals and declines. Benefactors like Attalos II of Pergamon built new monuments, including the reconstructed Stoa of Attalos that now houses the Agora Museum. But these were gifts from foreign rulers, not expressions of Athenian power. In 146 BCE, Rome conquered mainland Greece, ending even nominal Greek independence. Athens initially received favorable treatment from Rome, which admired Greek culture and allowed the city considerable autonomy. But in 86 BCE, Athens made the mistake of siding with King Mithridates of Pontus against Rome. The Roman general Sulla besieged and captured Athens, sacking the city and carrying off many art treasures. It was a disaster from which Athens never fully recovered. Under Roman rule, Athens became a university town, prized for its philosophical schools and cultural heritage, but politically powerless. Roman emperors, particularly those with Philhellenic tendencies like Hadrian, beautified the city with new buildings. Hadrian constructed an entire new quarter, marked by his triumphal arch inscribed, "This is Athens, the ancient city of Theseus on one side, and this is the city of Hadrian, and not of Theseus on the other," a telling acknowledgement of how power had shifted. In 267 CE, the Heruli, a Gothic tribe, sacked Athens, destroying much of the lower city. The citizens retreated behind hastily constructed walls, abandoning the Agora and much of the ancient city. Athens had become a provincial backwater, its glory long faded. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE, the pagan philosophical schools faced increasing persecution. In 529 CE, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools, including Plato's Academy, which had operated for nearly 900 years. This act symbolically ended ancient Athens. The rise of Athens to a leading position among Greek cities in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE was due to democracy, which led to an unparalleled blossoming of arts and sciences. The power of Athens extended far beyond Greece, throughout the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea regions. But even in ancient times, Athens' influence began to wane. Other cities took over its leading role: Alexandria, Antioch, Rome. These cities were larger, wealthier, and backed by kingdoms and empires with resources far beyond what a single city-state could command. Yet none of those successor cities could dispute Athens' place in history. This was the birthplace of democracy, the city where citizens first governed themselves through collective deliberation and voting. This was where philosophy, as we know it, was born, where Socrates questioned everything, where Plato imagined ideal forms, where Aristotle systematized knowledge. The word democracy itself comes from Athens: demos, people, and kratos, power. The Athenian experiment demonstrated that ordinary people could govern themselves, make complex decisions, create magnificent art, and achieve greatness without kings or tyrants. The Athenian model was not perfect. It excluded women, slaves, and resident aliens from citizenship. It could be manipulated by skilled demagogues. It sometimes made poor decisions driven by passion rather than reason. The execution of Socrates stands as a warning about the tyranny of the majority. But despite its flaws, Athenian democracy established principles that would inspire political revolutions millennia later. That government derives its legitimacy from the governed, that citizens should participate in decisions affecting their lives, that laws should be public and apply equally to all citizens, that leaders should be accountable to the people. When the American founding fathers designed their republic, they looked to Athens, as well as Republican Rome, for inspiration and warning. When modern democracies worldwide proclaim popular sovereignty, they echo ideas first articulated in ancient Athens: the legacy of drama. The theater was one of Athens' greatest gifts to world culture. The dramatic festivals held in honor of Dionysus gave birth to both tragedy and comedy as literary and performance art forms. Tragedy, particularly as developed by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, explored the deepest questions of human existence: the nature of justice, the conflict between human will and divine fate, the consequences of hubris, the proper response to suffering. These plays, written 2,500 years ago, still speak to modern audiences because they address universal human concerns. Comedy, especially as practiced by Aristophanes, provided sharp social and political criticism wrapped in outrageous humor and fantasy. Aristophanes' plays mocked politicians, intellectuals, social trends, and even the gods themselves, a freedom of speech that was essential to Athenian democracy. The physical structure of the Greek theater, the semicircular seating, theatron, facing a circular performance space, orchestra, with a building, skene, providing backdrop and backstage area, established a form still used in theaters worldwide. The conventions of dramatic structure, acts and scenes, dialogue and soliloquy, the unity of time and place, influenced Western drama for centuries. Every time we attend a play, we participate in a cultural tradition that began in the Theater of Dionysus in Athens, where citizens gathered to watch masked actors perform stories of gods and heroes, to laugh at satire, and to reflect on the human condition. The legacy of philosophy. The philosophical tradition begun in Athens shaped Western thought in countless ways. Socrates' insistence on questioning assumptions, his method of examining ideas through dialogue, the Socratic method, remained central to education and intellectual inquiry. Plato's theory of forms, his vision of an ideal state ruled by philosopher kings, his examination of justice, beauty, and truth, these ideas have been debated, adapted, and criticized for over 2 millennia. His academy served as a model for universities worldwide. Aristotle's systematic approach to knowledge, his logic, his ethics, his analysis of politics, his biological observations, all of these laid foundations for modern science and philosophy. His works were studied and commented upon by Islamic, Jewish, and Christian scholars throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, shaping intellectual development across civilizations. The later Athenian philosophical schools, Stoicism with its emphasis on virtue and emotional control, Epicureanism with its focus on pleasure rightly understood, skepticism with its questioning of certainty. Each contributed ideas that continue to resonate. When we debate ethics, seek truth through reason, question authority, or engage in philosophical reflection, we participate in traditions begun in the streets and schools of ancient Athens. The legacy of art and architecture, the Parthenon, still crowning the Acropolis after 2,500 years despite earthquakes, wars, fire, explosion, and pollution, remains one of the world's most recognizable buildings. Its image appears on countless books, posters, and tourist materials. It has been imitated in government buildings, museums, and banks across the world. The Parthenon established aesthetic principles that dominated Western architecture for centuries. Proportion, symmetry, the use of columns and pediments, the relationship between structure and decoration. The classical orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, developed by Greek architects, were adopted by Romans and have been revived repeatedly in Western architecture, from the Renaissance to the neoclassical movement to the modern era. Greek sculpture, with its emphasis on naturalistic representation of the human body, its balance between idealization and realism, established standards that influenced art from Roman times through the Renaissance to the present. The contrapposto pose, the attention to anatomy, the rendering of drapery, all techniques pioneered by Greek sculptors, became fundamental to Western figurative art. When architects design public buildings with columns and pediments, when sculptors create realistic human figures, when artists seek to express ideals of beauty and harmony, they draw on traditions established in ancient Athens. The legacy of ideas. Perhaps Athens' most lasting legacy is the idea that humans can understand the world through reason, that knowledge is achievable through systematic inquiry, that the universe operates according to principles that can be discovered and understood. This faith in human reason, this belief in the power of logos, word, reason, principle, is the foundation of Western science and philosophy. The pre-Socratic philosophers, many working in Greek cities of Asia Minor, but part of the same intellectual tradition as Athens, began the scientific revolution by seeking natural rather than supernatural explanations for phenomena. When Thales predicted an eclipse through astronomical calculation, when Democritus proposed that matter was composed of atoms, when Hippocrates insisted that diseases had natural causes rather than divine origins, they established principles of rational inquiry that would eventually lead to modern science. Athens valued education, debate, and the free exchange of ideas. This created an intellectual climate where innovation could flourish. The willingness to question tradition, to propose new ideas, to follow arguments wherever they led, this Athenian legacy remains central to scientific and scholarly enterprise. To visit the Acropolis today is to walk directly through history. It is to climb the same rocky hill that Pericles climbed, to stand where Socrates stood, to view the same landscape that inspired philosophers, dramatists, and artists 2,500 years ago. The restoration work continues, as it has for decades. Architects like Nikos Toganidis and Tassos Tanoulas lead teams using the latest technology to understand and preserve these ancient monuments. They work with profound respect for the ancient builders, increasingly amazed by the technical and artistic achievements revealed by careful study. The modern visitor ascends the sacred way, passing through the Propylaea, emerging onto the Acropolis summit where the Parthenon stands. Though damaged by time, war, and pollution, the building retains its power to inspire awe. The honey-colored Pentelic marble glows in the Mediterranean sunlight. The columns, though some are missing or damaged, still convey the building's original proportions and harmony. Inside the on-site museum, and in the Acropolis Museum at the base of the hill, visitors can examine the Parthenon sculptures up close, seeing the skill of the ancient carvers in rendering marble as if it were flowing cloth or living flesh. They can trace the Panathenaic procession along the frieze, identifying the horsemen, the elders, the basket-bearers, the sacrificial animals. In the Agora below, excavations continue to reveal the ancient city. The reconstructed Stoa of Attalos houses the American School's excellent museum displaying finds from the excavations, pottery, sculpture, coins, the bronze ballots used in jury votes, the Clariterion, allotment machine, used to select citizens for jury service by lot. Walking through the ancient Agora, one can imagine the scene 2,500 years ago, citizens debating in the shade of the Stoas, merchants selling their wares, philosophers teaching their students, the constant hum of vibrant democracy in action. The Theater of Dionysus, on the south slope of the Acropolis, still holds performances during the annual Athens Festival, continuing a theatrical tradition spanning 2,500 years. To watch a play there, under the stars, with the Acropolis looming above, is to connect directly with the ancient past.